Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share my full review, the digitally digested segment, for the Microsoft Surface Pro 6. Now, this is the Core i7, of course, that is an Intel 8th generation CPU, complemented by 16 gigs of RAM and a 512 gig NVMe drive. This is the black matte finish, which is new to the Surface Pro 6 line, and you're looking at roughly $2,000 for what sits in front of the camera right now, because of course the type cover is not included, neither is the pen. Microsoft has moved very far from its original introduction with the first Surface Pro to what we have today here in the 6th generation. And I know my update was brief, and that's because, quite frankly, there isn't much to say about the 6th gen Surface Pro other than that we finally have a quad-core processor, and that is a big deal. However, the fact that the processor has been on the market for quite some time now doesn't leave me as excited or as enthusiastic as I would have been about this product had it come out last year. Of course, it does perform much better than a dual-core Surface Pro, but that really is only for those of you in the market that need to utilize the extra cores. And I think the majority of users out there are not looking to get a quad-core option or don't even know the difference between a quad-core and dual-core option. What does that mean? Well, if you plan on doing photo or video editing, then the 6th generation is best in class, no question about it. And don't get me wrong, it outperforms the previous generation in every way. But when it comes to design, capability, if you're not doing any photo or video editing, not much has changed. The screen resolution, the form factor, whatever they've tweaked, it really doesn't amount to much other than that now we've got the color black. And that's why I will continue to reemphasize and pound it into everybody that it's a big deal that we've got an 8th gen quad-core chip. It's just a year late. And as a result, there really, with that as a starting point, there are only other things for me to complain about, like the fact that there's no Type-C port, because again, it's about to be 2019, and we do not have a Type-C port in a product that, in my opinion, is built for that sort of connectivity. Rather than having multiple connections, why wouldn't you have one? Granted, I also understand that Microsoft invested a lot of money in their proprietary charging system. Don't misunderstand that for a moment. You can see it right there. And I understand that they want to hold on to it. You know, you get a mini display port out as well as a USB 3.0, but that's the extent of things. You don't really get anything else. And that's a problem because we are looking at, I didn't say this at the top, but I'll say it now, this is the best portable hybrid 2-in-1 on the market. If you're looking for a tablet that can replace your laptop, this is it. Anyone who thinks their iPad Pro can replace a laptop isn't using a laptop as I think the majority of users would. The iPad Pro, strictly content consumption, light email use, fine, perfect, for that. However, if you actually require a full-blown operating system in a similar form factor with not identical but similar battery life, the Surface Pro 6, even I don't care which configuration you go with, is infinitely better. It makes more sense. You will get more out of it. It will be a machine that you use on a regular basis, not just for content consumption, but more. However, that of course comes with a catch as well. While I like the fact that we have, of course, expandable storage with the micro SD card slot on the back of the unit, and the fact that the type cover has only improved over the years, I would like to see a larger touchpad. It's pretty much standard across all laptops, and even though this is a 2-in-1, because clearly this does come off, I would like to see it. I mean, I know this wasn't the year of the redesign, and that's where I come to the next big thing, which I think a lot of people are going to be surprised to hear from me, but it's the most frequent complaint that I get about people who aren't drawn to the Surface Pro line, and that is that Windows needs a refresh. Now, I know it's in the works. That's neither here nor there. The point is that when I look at the Surface Pro 6, I say to myself, beyond the 8th gen quad-core chip, what is game-changing about this device? And there isn't anything else. That is the problem. And with the premium you're paying for something like the model here, the i7 with the 16 gigs of RAM and the 512 gig NVMe drive, there should be more. Because, quite frankly, the VAIO that I've leaned on for years, which those of you that follow my channel know I'm talking about the VAIO Z Canvas, this really does not take it to another level. Yes, battery life is better, but beyond that, and yes, of course, the 8th gen quad-core processor outperforms the 4th gen Haswell in the VAIO, but how has it taken this long for a quad-core chip to make it into this form factor? Well, quite frankly, it's because how many users needed to utilize a quad-core processor? Not many. That's why Microsoft was never inclined to push for something like this. That's why VAIO did. Now, this isn't about VAIO. It's more about a point in terms of where we are in terms of our economy, what's being mass-produced, and the fact that this is the best device of its kind. Now, had competition stayed alive, that might be another story. Had the Surface Pro, really outshined everything, I don't think the iPad Pro would really have a place. And if you go back to my old videos, I predicted that Apple would introduce an iPad Pro and people would get confused and think they were competing products when they absolutely are not. But as I said before, I think part of the problem that the Surface Pro line now, and listen, I am a Windows user. Anyone who's listening to this video, if you think I'm an Apple user, think again. Watch my videos and you'll instantly know I may have grown up on some Apple products like many of the people from my generation, but above and beyond that, I respect and understand the niche that they occupy, but the world runs on Windows. Welcome to reality. And as a result, that's where a product like this, if it had a new OS, if it had something that really, truly embraced the fact that this is a 12.3-inch tablet, I think we would be looking at a far more impressive product. Now, I might be the only person saying this. I might be one of many. I don't know. But that is what I come away with the fact that the only thing we've really gained out of the previous generation, I'll go back to the Surface Pro 4. I'll take us back to 2015. And then the confusion of last year where they didn't want to call it the Surface Pro 5. So they found their identity here in the Surface Pro 6 because they realized they were confusing customers rather than making it more simple. And kudos for that. And finally getting a quad-core chip in there, whether you think the masses care or not. But that's only because, again, economies of scale and the fact that mass production of 8th gen mobile processors has been going on for basically a year. So it's finally trickling down. And that's my biggest gripe with this. So it's, I've mentioned that Windows 10 needs a revamp, especially for the Surface lineup. I mean, the Surface Book 2, another story. It's a laptop. This is not. This is supposed to be both. And if it's truly going to be both, this Windows S Mode crap has got to go. I mean, I know there are those of you that are loyal to it, but the tablet mode of Windows 10 is straight garbage. And until we see a true revamp, a true rebuild, throwing in an 8th gen processor is only going to help that niche audience like myself. So I don't want anyone to really misunderstand this. It sounds like I'm being incredibly negative, incredibly critical of what Microsoft has done here. But lest we forget, without what Microsoft has done here, we wouldn't have an option. There wouldn't be competing products. I wouldn't have had the opportunity to ever purchase a VAIO. The problem I have with what Microsoft has done is that they went from innovating, as they did with the first, second generations, third, where they actually, started changing design cues, and the fourth. And I feel like since the fourth, we've been at a stall. We haven't seen a lot of change. And that is a big problem, in my opinion. And it's not something any reviewers, publications, no one has really made mention of this. Yes, they say it's the best product of its kind, and I completely agree with that. But if asked, hey, Ed, should I purchase the brand new Surface Pro 6 or go with a Surface Pro 5 or maybe even a 4 at a discounted price? Well, my answer would be based on your use. And if you don't plan on doing heavy 4K video editing or Photoshop with incredibly large raw files, I can't recommend going to the 6th generation. And I certainly can't recommend the 6th generation in terms of its entry-level options, meaning the 8 gig pairing. No way. I mean, if you're using Lightroom, if you're using full Photoshop, if you're doing any kind of 4K video editing, yes, you've got that quad-core processor. It's a great thing to have, but it isn't going to make for a fantastic experience. You're really going to have to step up to the 16 gig version, which is why I went with the 16 gig version. Anyone who remembers my Surface Pro 4 reviews knows that I went with what I thought would be the best seller, which was an 8 gig model. And it was. And in this generation, the 8 gig model may be the best seller, the i5 pairing, of course, yet again, because it is the most affordable and powerful, I would say, dollar for dollar option. But if you really care about the quad-core processor, you're not doing this system justice by having 8 gigs of RAM. That's just my personal opinion. You must go with the i7 16 gig option if you actually plan on using this to its full potential. And yes, there will be throttling, but still, you do have a quad-core processor now and can make use of those cores, something you couldn't do in the past. Now, you may have noticed on my desktop, which has remained static this whole time, I'm sorry, but I'm really not, there are some games installed as well. I've already installed much of the software that I had on here because this is going back, and it's going back simply because of what I've stated so far. It's a best-in-class product, but I can't help but feel like Microsoft has moved closer and closer to Apple's strategy of selling us products. Again, we're getting old hardware, not any true innovation, and we're paying premium top dollar for it. And Apple is the one who started this entire craze with less is more, except they mean that literally, and I wholeheartedly disagree. And yes, a Type-C port is that big of a deal. For those of you saying, I don't use Type-C, guess what? In a year, you'll wish you had it. And if it had a Type-C port, it's not just about charging and general connectivity. That means hooking it up to an external graphics card. It means turning this into a legitimate desktop. Now, I'm not saying that the 8th gen processors in here are ideal for it, but why make sure a customer couldn't use it? Microsoft doesn't really make a desktop other than the Surface Studio 2, and that still does not have the GPU horsepower that you can find with something, of course, like the 2080 Ti that I'm using right now quite happily. So let's talk about gaming. And this is another reason that this is not a revolutionary product, but more of an evolutionary one. You can see I've got some games installed. Games like Rust, PlayerUnknown, and Call of Duty, World War II. What I can tell you is that you don't really want to play any of these games except for Rust. That will run. PlayerUnknown, even at the lowest settings, the experience is going to be less than ideal. So what does that mean? It means the integrated graphics, and of course, this machine is not made for gaming, but I used to do gaming benchmarks with Surface Pro models. I don't do it anymore because we really have not moved forward, and that's because, as anyone who knows anything about CPU performance on its own, dual core is all you really need for gaming. So the quad core element, even though this does outperform the 5th generation, the previous generation, in every realm, it doesn't do so by enough for me to tell you that if you're, again, I'm going to repeat it, if you aren't video editing in 4K and you aren't dealing with heavy Photoshop usage, or let's say running Revit, any of the AutoCAD, like really intensive software, you're not going to see a benefit with the quad-core chip. You just aren't. And the integrated graphics is not going to give you enough juice to do really more than we could 2 generations ago. And that's the real story here. No crap. I don't care what anyone else has to say. If you want to play Counter-Strike, if you want to play Team Fortress 2, you can do that. But you could do that 3 years ago. So in terms of gameplay, game performance, of course, the Surface Pro has not improved. Would I like to see it improve? Of course I would. Do I think it's, expected not to have moved forward? Yeah, because this is predominantly a business machine. It's not meant to be a gaming one. And that's why a Type-C port is important. So for all of you out there who are going to say in the comments, and I'm sure there will be, Ed, why are you talking about gaming? It's a Surface Pro. Come on, man. Very simply put, if we had a Type-C port, I wouldn't be talking about it because then you could actually game. And that is one of those things where, again, we've gone from innovation to evolution, and it's just sad. I'd have a lot more positive things to say about this. So basically, the moral of the story here is, I've benchmarked it. I've put it through its paces. Battery life is great. The keyboard is great. The screen is great. It's all positive stuff. Okay? At the end of the day, I'm not going to tell you that the Surface Pro 6 is not the best 2-in-1 on the market, because guess what? It is. But that doesn't mean it warrants a purchase. And that's because the previous generation, I cannot tell you, when I first reviewed the Vaio and was excited about the fact that it was the first tablet to pack a quad-core processor, I got a lot of negative feedback saying there's no point in having a quad-core processor. The majority of software only supports dual-core. Well, it comes to bite you in the ass here, doesn't it? Because now we've got a quad-core, and that means that this generation really was designed for a niche market, wasn't it? Because today, yes, more software supports quad-core than in the past, but certainly not enough to make an argument to shun the 7th gen or even the 6th gen. Intel processors. So if you were to go back a generation to the Surface Pro that was unnumbered, or even the Surface Pro 4, you're going to do pretty well. Especially when you think about pricing. And with the holiday season upon us, coming right around the corner, and Black Friday and all that time to waste your money, this is already going on sale, folks. For those of you unaware, the Surface Pro 6 over Black Friday will be discounted, as will the Surface Book 2. And there's a reason. It's because, again, this is not an innovative product. And my basis for saying that is because my old Vaio, again, this does run circles around it on benchmarks, but it has a quad-core Intel Haswell chip. And yes, it doesn't have the battery life of this machine, but it does have everything this doesn't. It does have a full-size SD card slot, an Ethernet port, HDMI out, as well as DisplayPort out, a mini DisplayPort. So charitable. It also has, I mentioned Ethernet. It just, the I/O is night and day compared to this thing. And the screen performance on my old Vaio is still superior in terms of Adobe RGB accuracy. So if you're going to make the business argument, if you're a photographer, look, it's still best in class for its type. I think if you're a photographer, this is a great choice. However, you don't really need the 6th gen, do you? Unless you are going the distance, as I've mentioned, with a model like this, because you know that you need the i7 paired with at least 16 gigs of RAM, maybe a 1 terabyte NVMe, and you're in business because now you've got a mobile workstation. Of course, the bottleneck still lies in a little bit of I'm not going to say a lot, but a little bit of, heat issues going on, which does lead to throttling. That will always be an issue with a design like this, so thin, so light. You're under 2 pounds. What can you expect? Well, with an iPad Pro, you can expect iOS. And that's why when I said that Windows needs to do something new with their operating system, I don't think I'm being incredibly critical here, because the one thing that has been a constant through all of the Surface devices pretty much that I've reviewed is that we've been looking at Windows 10 and a tablet side that is DOA. And again, I know people will say, oh, I use the Windows tablet mode. Listen, you're in a minority. Get with the program. I'm glad you like it. Most people don't. And that's why most people cannot look at the Surface Pro and say, you know what? This is a viable tablet option for me. It's not that it's too heavy. You know how many people think that the 12.9-inch iPad Pro isn't too heavy? And that's got a mobile operating system. So Microsoft, wake up. If you improve what you do best, which is software, that's what really makes you your money. I know you've shifted to hardware. This thing will start to fly off the shelves. You wouldn't need to but discount it so quickly as they are going to. I think it's going to be like up to $300 off of select configurations. I'll include any info if I've got it. But I've already seen the teasers for the Black Friday sales. This thing's going down $300 in price, and it came out mid-October. That tells you what you need to know. If this was a revolutionary product, that wouldn't be happening. And don't get me wrong, build quality, fantastic, cameras improved. These are all good things, but the I/O selection, talk about crippling a device. that you finally blessed with a quad-core processor. It doesn't make any sense. I'm just scratching my head. So again, it is the best of its kind. And if money is no object, jump on board, buy it. Just remember what I've said. You're going to get great battery life. You're going to get great performance out of that 8th gen quad-core processor, but you better pair it with the 16 gigs of RAM and that i7 rather than the i5 if you plan on doing 4K video editing, as well as, of course, anything Adobe related, Revit related, well, I just should say Autodesk related, anything rendering related. I mean, you don't have a GPU here, so you need the best CPU that you can fit inside this slate, and that is the i7. And you do need the extra RAM because as soon as you start running Photoshop, forget about 4K video editing, that 8 gigs of RAM is going to be maxed out. I'm just telling you right now. That will affect pen input. It'll affect everything. So I'm making the recommendation that I am for a very specific reason. I don't want any of you to purchase this under false pretense, think you're going to get one thing, and then find out, you could have just bought a 4th gen or a 5th gen and saved yourself some money, and that the black color is really the biggest improvement because they finally embraced what Razer has been doing for years, which is a matte black finish. And Microsoft did it once upon a time too. They just phased it out. Don't ask me why. I don't work for them. We all know that. And I don't get anything from them to review either. And I even have a family member that works for them, but that's besides the point. So again, Surface Pro 6 is best in class, but who are they really competing with? Yeah, I know there are offerings from Lenovo, and I know HP, and Samsung even tries with their Galaxy Book, but they're all shoddy at best when you get down to delivering a turnkey solution like the Surface Pro line. Especially, it pretty much is, as we know, what you would want because it's coming from the manufacturers and developers of Windows. So it's a no-brainer. But with everything I've said, the other part of that no-brainer is not to shell out money for this new 6th gen unless you absolutely need the quad-core chip, which again, I think is a really small niche. I mean, after all, how many users are actual content creators and photographers? Is it 10%? I don't know. I don't know the statistics. I don't own Microsoft stock anymore. I don't follow it closely enough. Generally, when I have that knowledge, I drop it on you. You know that if you follow me. But I can't imagine that they have a very large following that is based around content creation with this device. Don't get me wrong. It's designed for content creation. That's its pitfall. The pitfall is that it's targeting content creation. And if you go back to my videos covering the Vaio Z when it launched, I actually said this is aimed at a very narrow market. Well, now you've got a much better version of the Vaio Z, at least from a processor standpoint, but it's missing everything that made the Vaio Z unique. And it's 2018. So again, this is not Type-C-itis. It's more like common sense, which isn't very common these days, at least in the United States, maybe around the rest of the world as well. And missing Type-C isn't just about having one cable to charge or using it for video out, even though it can do both of those things, which is incredibly convenient. I mean, there's no Thunderbolt on this either. So, I mean, there are just so many things that I got to scratch my head and say, you're charging Apple prices, and now you're acting like them too. I don't want to see this continue as a trend. And, when Microsoft first stepped into the hardware business, it was all about innovation. The Surface Book, the Surface Laptop, innovation. Although, granted, the Surface Laptop I'm not a fan of. Many people love it, swear by it. Best laptop they've ever owned. And I understand why. But again, no Type-C. And even though today is all about the Surface Pro, and I think I said I was going to make this quick. Whoops, sorry. Not having that Type-C takes this from being a really multi-purpose, not just a portable 2-in-1, to possibly being your desktop daily driver, and it breaks that for content creators, in my opinion. The fact that this can't have an external GPU hooked up is just a dumb mistake or an intentional profit gouge. a margin gouge, and I think it's the latter. I think it's an intentional margin gouge. And if we do see a complete revamp next year, which I think we will, I had hoped for it this year, but there still isn't even a Surface Book 3. Come on, man. Where's the Surface Book 3? It's going to obviously be sometime next year. And I'm afraid of how they're going to cripple that thing, knowing what they did here. I mean, I was so excited. We're finally getting a quad-core chip, and then they take away everything that would make it actually valuable. So I got to carry around a bag of dongles and adapters and come on, this isn't Apple, man. This is Windows. This is Microsoft. Don't make me feel like I'm buying Apple products. If I want to buy Apple products, you bet I will. Because this is not a budget issue. This is, again, a common sense issue. And that's why I mentioned Windows needing to get updated, because I will swear by Windows 10, but the reality is that it's time for a real tablet OS. And if you've got to make a deal with Android, just do it already. What are you waiting for? If you've got to make a deal with Apple, do it. Just make some kind of concession on the tablet side so that the Surface Pro 2 is not just the tablet that can replace your laptop, it's also a tablet. That's how I'm going to put it. So, because I feel like in the marketing push to make sure that everyone knew this was a tablet that could replace your laptop, well, Microsoft has forgotten that it's a tablet. And I hope that makes sense to all of you. Again, build quality exceptional, screen is great, performance is fantastic, the keyboard, the type cover is better than it's ever been. But the I/O and not necessarily getting a larger screen, which I think it's time for a larger Surface Pro. I mean, it took long enough to get to the above 12 inches. Let's get a bigger one. Come on, man. I've been saying come on, man, a lot. Come on. Let's just stick with that. It's time for a larger form factor. I mean, you gave us options everywhere else. The Surface Book, you got options. Here, for some reason, there are none. And I know they pay for marketing research. I think it's time to go back to the drawing board on this. I like it. I'd be keeping it if I didn't feel the way that I clearly do, as expressed through the course of this video. So, again, great quad-core 8th gen processor, a little too late and a little too expensive. And then too few options when it comes to I/O, and then the gouge on the pen, they should still be including the pen. I know Apple doesn't include the pen, but Apple was so late with even introducing pen input. Let's not get started on that. And that's why all of the competition that sells 2-in-1s does include the pen. They do include a keyboard in many options, and they do this because they know Surface Pro garners the market share. And I get it. There's a reason. You can go to a Microsoft store the same way you can go to an Apple store, and they're going to be turnkey on getting you fixed and out of there. The support is better. That's a very strong selling point. But, again, I cannot recommend the Surface Pro 6 unless you absolutely understand everything that I've told you, and you must have the top of the line, one of the top two top of the line, the i7 configs, in order to handle, again, really intensive stuff. Because Microsoft has basically tried to push what used to be a niche CPU to mass market. And that really is the sum of the parts of the Surface Pro 6, is that the claim to fame is we finally got a quad core, and guess what? The majority of you do not need it. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Hit that like button, and as usual, please feel free to subscribe. Later.